Hey folks, Brian with you again, and we're going to look at something that we might easily miss. We've already looked at the big picture of Ephesians 3, 1 to 13. We're going to pick out something very small, something that we might pass right over unless we're really careful and are looking diligently at the text. It's something that we find in verse 8. And this is what Paul says, "To me, the very least of all saints, this grace was given, to preach to the Gentiles the unfathomable riches of Christ." So the statement that I want you to focus on is this one: to me, the very least of all saints. In the Greek, literally it says, to me, the leaster of all saints. And the Apostle Paul actually coined a brand new word here, the leaster of all the saints. And Paul made similar statements like this one in other books as well. For example, in 1 Corinthians 15:9, he calls himself the least of the apostles. Here in Ephesians 3:8, he calls himself the very least of all saints. And in 1 Timothy 1:15, he says, I am the foremost of sinners. Now, what's interesting is that the longer that Paul walked with Jesus and knew Christ, the more humble he became and the less exalted view of himself he had. What I'm saying is this: Paul wrote from those three letters, 1 Corinthians, Ephesians, and 1 Timothy, those three letters, the very first one that was written was 1 Corinthians. And in that one, he says, I am the least of all the apostles. The second letter written of those three was Ephesians. I am the very least of all saints. So he goes from the least of the apostles to the least of all the saints. And then the final letter in that series was 1 Timothy, where he says, I am the foremost of sinners. You see the progression? At first he says, I'm the least of the apostles. Well, that's still a pretty big accomplishment to be one of the apostles. Then later on he says, I'm the least of all the saints. So he's growing lower in his estimation of himself. And then later on in his life he says, I am the foremost of sinners. So the idea here that we need to grab and catch a hold of and apply to our life is, the longer we walk with Jesus, the more humble we should be becoming. This modern idea of secular psychology, the emphasis upon self-esteem within the church and how we all need to have this exalted view of ourselves is just not biblical. It doesn't come from the Bible. It comes from psychology. And I would like to ask everyone to pray that the Lord would help you to become more and more humble the longer you walk with the Lord Jesus. Because if you do that, you'll be following the example of the Apostle Paul, which is a really good example for us.